So a majority of the information we have for Borderlands 4 is pointing towards the story being more interesting and just better than it was in Borderlands 3, whether that be the removal of out-of-world memes or the main story being much more serious. Pretty much everything we've been shown bodes very well for the main campaign and the story, but one thing that I don't think a lot of people have talked about is how you're actually going to be going through that story, because we actually have a lot of information on how this is going to work, and it seems that we are going to be getting the first non-linear Borderlands story, allowing you to essentially choose what section of the story you go to next. And there's quite a lot of information we have that seems to be really interesting in how we're going to be playing through this. Now, I think the best place to start is the information on how we're going to be going through the different parts of the campaign and going through the different zones. I do also want to go over the information on the different zones that we have, because there's going to be like an end boss for each zone, and there's going to be different factions specific to those zones. But the really important part is that an interview with Andrew Reiner, who is Gearbox Global Creative Executive Officer, gives us some really important information. So he goes on to say, "We have an awesome story campaign, but for the first time, we're allowing you to play through this in a non-linear fashion. There's a point in the game where you have a choice of going to 3 different story locations and picking at it the way you want. And you'll go to new regions that are just massive. This is the biggest world we've created." So the really important part about that is that at some point in the story, you get to choose between 3 different places to go, and you'll be able to do that in any order you want. Now, this will probably have a really big impact on repeat playthroughs when playing other characters, but we'll go over that more later on in the video. Now, something that's really interesting with this is there are 4 zones at the launch of the game. These 4 massive seamless zones. So why do we only have the choice of 3? And I think I actually have the answer, and I don't think I've really seen anybody talk about this or put this together. So first off, we do know there is a starting scenario or story beat that you're not necessarily in any of the zones. This is essentially the Vault Hunters getting to the planet, and I don't want to give any other spoilers or anything because there have been some leaks on what this is, but there is a story scenario to start you off. Now, based upon the information we're going to be going over, I think after that starting scenario, you choose one of the 3 different starter zones or non-endgame zones. So Fade Fields, Carcadia Burn, and Terminus Range. So those 3 zones seem to be the 3 ones you'll be able to choose between. The 4th zone is Dominion, but we do have other information that Dominion is where the Timekeeper is, and it's a more end game zone that you won't have access to like the other ones. And this information comes from a Game Informer article, and they've had a lot of exclusives about the game, so they actually do have a lot of information on the game. And they go on to say that in contrast to much of the rest of Borderlands 4's open world, you don't get access to Dominion until later in the game when you are on your march to confront the Timekeeper. Using an event that occurs on Pandora's moon Elpis, which is now in the orbit of Kairos, the Vault Hunters can enter Dominion with the hopes of facing off against the Timekeeper. Now, on a side note, we have gotten a bunch of different screenshots of the moon of Elpis breaking apart. It seems like that's going to be what actually allows us to get to the Timekeeper city, which is the Dominion zone in the game. So this information is that we won't get access to this until later in the game. Now, I think a lot of people have been thinking that because the public playtest that they have ran so far has started everybody in Fade Fields, that everybody thinks Fade Fields is the starter zone. But I don't think that's true. I think we go through this starting scenario and then we choose one of the 3 zones that we went over to be our starting zone. And then after we get through that zone, we choose another one of the starter zones and then the final one. And then after we're done with all 3 of those, then we get to be able to go to Dominion, the city of the Timekeeper. So in my opinion, this is not only going to make repeat playthroughs of the main campaign and main story much more interesting, but it's going to make your first playthrough even more interesting because you're going to have different playthroughs than a lot of other players, and it's just going to allow you to kind of focus on where you want to go next. It'll also allow for some crazy different options for like speed running and stuff like that. I think something like this will actually make a much larger speed running community, because the amount of testing you have to do and experimenting and stuff like that will just be absolutely crazy, because depending on the order and the time you spend in each zones, you may be weaker or stronger if you start with one zone first and another zone second. Maybe another one of the zones is much more difficult in general just because of the type of enemies that are there. So maybe you want to save that one till later on when you have better gear or something like that. So there's just a lot of options, and it just makes the main campaign much more interesting, and it makes the gameplay much more interesting as well. Now, I did also want to go over the 4 different zones, because we actually have a lot of information on what is going to be present within them. So first off, we have Fade Fields. With radiant beaches, whimsical rolling hills, and verdant forests, the Fade Fields appears to be a temperate paradise, but under the serene veneer, danger lurks among darkness and long buried secrets. Idolater Soul rules the Fade Fields ruthlessly, controlling food and supplies to appease his beloved timekeeper. Now, that's one of the first pieces of information we have, is that there are going to be end bosses of every zone. The Fade Fields is Idolater Soul, which is that really big guy that we've seen in a bunch of different gameplay and a bunch of different screenshots. Now, some additional information we've gotten from one of the Borderlands 4 official videos is that the 3 starter zones, we know there are going to be different factions in them that are led by different characters that we are going to be meeting and we're going to be friendly with. So in Fade Fields, again, the end boss is Idolater Soul, but the zone is also going to have the Outbanders faction in them, and they're going to be led by Rush. This is also the really built guy that we've seen like handing out water and stuff to other NPCs. So that's the end boss, the faction, and the leader of the faction that we're going to be encountering in the Fade Fields. Then we have Carcadia Burn, which is described as pockmarked sandscapes and jagged desert canyons dot the landscape of Carcadia Burn, which has been fractured and torn apart by a celestial cataclysm. Here, the Rippers swarm to fulfill the vision of their queen, siphoning resources to fuel their fight against the Order. Caught in between warring armies, the Electi fight a dire battle for survival. So this is a more desert zone, but it's also going to be like a cataclysm happened here, and it seems to be the zone most affected by the moon of Elpis just kind of appearing around the planet and destroying the veil around the planet. Now, we did get more information in that description, but in Carcadia Burn, the Ripper Queen is going to be the end boss and the leader of the Ripper faction, but the friendly faction here are going to be the Electi, led by Levane. And she's also that really golden woman, and these are people that used to be in the city of Dominion, but when Elpis appeared and Dominion was shut down, they were left outside the city gates. Then for the final of the 3 starting zones, we have Terminus Range. The towering peaks of Terminus Range are as unsympathetic as they are cold. Shadowed secrets, both ancient and man-made, hide beneath the windswept mountain passes and blinding sandstorms. The hardy and insular augurs, when they art mining or night under vile elixir's terrifying gaze, clutch to warm in their carved halls. So this is going to be a more snowy and mountainous focused area, and the end boss of this zone is going to be Vile Lictor. Now, what's pretty interesting with this is that he also seems to be the leader or the kind of dictator of the Augurs, which is the friendly faction we come across in this zone, but they seem to be generally led by a character called Calder, which is that smaller character with like the staff and the big beard that we've seen through multiple screenshots and through some footage. So it seems like the friendly faction is also somehow connected to Vile Lictor, but Vile Lictor is the end boss of this zone. But that brings us to what is seeming to be the late game zone and the final zone of the game and the final zone of the main story, and this is Dominion. An unwavering monument to the Timekeeper's absolute control, Dominion City towers about Kairos, a constant reminder of his power. But beneath the glimmer of its pearlescent promenades, citizens huddle in ramshackle dwellings and pray for escape from the walled city, or for the Timekeeper to bestow his favor upon them. Now, we haven't gotten any information if there's going to be some friendly faction here or some friendly leader of a friendly faction. We just know that Dominion is seeming to just be a city or primarily focus on a city, and it's where the Timekeeper is. This is his city. And I do think the zone is going to be really cool. I think because of the way they're going about this with the 3 starter zones, and then we unlock the city of Dominion, I think this city is probably going to be something that has had a lot of work put into it to feel like you're getting to this final crazy zone that's this city run by the Timekeeper. I think it's going to be pretty spectacular and really unique when compared to pretty much anything else in the Borderlands franchise. So I'm actually very excited to finally get to this city because I think it's going to be pretty crazy. Now, as I mentioned, the ability to choose where you want to start off and then choose where you want to go next for the first 3 zones and essentially first 3 chapters of the game, I think it's just going to make the main campaign much more interesting. But as I mentioned, it will also make multiple runs of the main campaign much more interesting in general if we will actually have to be running the main campaign with other characters. Another one of my big hopes for Borderlands 4 is that after you beat the game on one character and get to max level, that you're just able to create other characters that are max level, or at least you're able to create other characters that don't have to go through the main campaign, like something similar to, say, Diablo 4, where after you've completed the main campaign, you can just skip it on other characters and go level them up doing events or just farming bosses or something. But I do think the first playthrough of this campaign is probably going to be one of the most interesting, at least based upon, say, gameplay and just variation of areas you can go and just having control over where you go. Even if the story isn't that great, which I think it will be much better than Borderlands 3, I think the campaign overall, especially with the gameplay, will still be really good. So in my opinion, this is just a really good addition to the Borderlands franchise. This kind of reminds me of some World of Warcraft expansions where we get a handful of new zones, but then you can choose which one to go level in first and kind of choose your path throughout the main campaign. So I think that'll just make the story and the main campaign and the gameplay just generally better. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.